welcome to Property Roundup here on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view and activity on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Cox, Managing Director at Carrig Conservation International Limited. Peter, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Carol.
Peter, I have so many questions for you that normally when we're getting ready to record an interview, we get straight into it. I've already taken up so much of your time because actually when we look at conservation of buildings and we look at retrofit and we're trying to understand how to sustainably bring a building back to life or to restore it to its former glory or what will be its future glory. There's a lot of miscommunication, misreporting out there. So you might just take a moment to explain the work that you do in Carrig Conservation and how that helps.
Sure. Carrig I formed actually 30 years ago this year, which is surprising to me. But I suppose when I look at my grey hairs, it's not that surprising. And I set it up as a technical science-led consultancy advising architects, engineers, building owners, building managers, and state parties in the kind of technical conservation of our buildings, our older buildings. And that was based on having kind of worked in the industry as a supplier of products for the conservation of our older buildings. And I just felt a lot of professionals, you know, an architect does what, 7 years to qualify. But when you look at the courses that are around the world, not one of them is concentrated on conservation or indeed materials. And my own background is in material science. So I wanted to offer a science-led technical advice rather than an architectural-led advice. And obviously I've survived 30 years through about 3 recessions and COVID and everything else. So I think it's worked pretty well. We're now internationally known. We work in Australia and Canada and America and all over Europe, which is great because you come in touch with so many different people, but also different buildings. I was very involved in an international organization called ICOMOS, which is the International Council of Monuments and Sites. And they are the technical advisory body to UNESCO on world and built heritage. And they were very concerned about this drive towards energy efficiency and what effect that was going to have on our heritage buildings. And I was asked to set up a work group. So ICOMOS Ireland, ICOMOS Belgium, and ICOMOS France came together to look at the different areas. And we came out with a report in 2011 saying that, yes, this is a threat because we're going to be using modern materials in a historic building or even a traditional building, because not all buildings are listed or protected. And from that, I got invited, or I was asked by ICOMOS International to represent them on a committee that was set up to write a new standard for guidelines in the energy retrofit of older buildings. And we've kind of gone away, Carol, from heritage, because when people think of heritage, they think of Trinity College or they think of Buckingham Palace or something like that. Whereas, you know, when we looked at, as part of this international European study to write this EN standard, we did our homework and we discovered that actually about 26 to 30% of our built environment, our housing stock, it dates from pre-1945, but only 8% of those have statutory protection. So we felt there's a very big kind of vulnerability for older buildings, for people to actually make wrong decisions or ill-informed decisions. And what we're finding now actually is that we've learned a lot in the meantime, but what we're finding now is that, yes, there is quite a lot of unintended consequences that happen if you do something wrong. And I think the problem today is that there aren't enough, um, let's say, educational programs to actually advise either building owners, building managers, architects, engineers, surveyors, and then to top it all, Europe came up with this idea around that time with the what we call in Ireland BER and what UK calls EPC, but it's the same system. It's the environmental um, performance certificate in the UK. It's building energy rating in Ireland. Now, in fairness to SEAI, who managed that system, the BER was designed for a post 1974 building, and it's a tick box situation. So they'll ask you, what is your external wall configuration? And if you say, well, it's 1974 or 1987, and it's a cavity wall with insulation in it, then they give it a particular rating. If it's a solid wall construction, which is most buildings pre-1945, they give it a default, and they give it a very high default rating. And therefore, advisors like architects, engineers are doing a calculation based on the wrong starting point.
I presume in that particular instance, you're also preserving the design integrity
Oh, absolutely.
of the building. And when I think of conservation, that's what I think of. But I didn't realize that maybe we are talking about building, the majority that aren't listed or aren't protected.
Yeah,
And they're probably the ones that are causing issues for
they are.
consumers who are actually either, whether it's through grants at the moment, are thinking of buying them or find themselves living in them and not sure how to start. Are they the ones we're getting wrong at the moment?
Absolutely. I think a more important building like Rubrics or any other building in Trinity College or any state building like the Custom House or whatever. I think we're more careful about that, and therefore you would be employing us or equal kind of experienced people to deal with that. But ordinary people that are buying let's say a 1930s or 1940s ex-council house in Crumlin, they don't know what to do. And if they get the wrong advice, either from a professional and sadly, I suppose another example, we did a study in 2019 that looked at the gap analysis on training and skills in energy retrofit of older buildings. And this was with us, Carrig, in conjunction with the Heritage Council of Ireland. And it was funded by the SEAI as a kind of an exercise. And when we did all our calculations, we thought we might get 60 people coming from the industry, but we wanted to widen that and have building owners and other people and actually people from the public sector as well, because they have to do their buildings too. And we released it online, and within 2 days we had 100 people signed up. And that was unfortunate. It was pre-COVID, so we were doing it in a live in-person situation, and that was the limit that the room could take. By the time we went live in October 2019, we had a 70 wait list. So that meant there is a real thirst for getting more information.
But that's very positive. I know you were probably analyzing from the gap of where we were to where we needed to get to, but actually sometimes there isn't an awareness there,
Yeah.
or there isn't an appetite, more importantly. So the fact that people want this knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely, and that proved that. Now,
Yeah.
sadly, COVID happened, and we didn't repeat the course. We've been talking to SEAI again more recently and saying, look, can we do it again? Because not only should we be doing this now, we did run one. It was actually the initiative of Wexford County Council came to us and said, would we do a series of 3 public awareness lectures in Ferns in County Wexford. And again, we had a full house every time we did it, and we did it over I think it was every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And to be honest, an awful lot of the people that came to that were building owners, like, people that owned older houses or wanted to buy an older house, or was inheriting, perhaps, because around the country there's so many empty houses. In the
Yeah.
70s, when the government decided farmhouses were too cold and damp and a health issue, they gave them grants to build bungalows on the land, and then the older house. And what we're finding now is some of the next generation are saying, well, I want to restore that farmhouse. And thankfully, and I have to commend the Department of Housing, local government, and heritage, and particularly the heritage sector under Malcolm Noonan, the Minister of State for Heritage. And he has introduced a number of new incentives where you can get a 50,000 kind of grant towards doing up an old farmhouse, for
Oh,
instance.
the vacant and derelict
Yeah,
homes grants.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
what. Peter, can we just go back there for a moment? Because actually, you've shaken one of my core understandings of rural Ireland. So I'm from rural Wicklow, but I live in rural Connemara now, and in Connemara, every small site has, many of them have the ruins or the outline of an
yeah,
old
yeah,
cottage,
yeah,
going back to
yeah,
the 1800s. Many of them have somewhat intact or partially intact 2-story farmhouse, kind of
yeah,
2 up, 2 down, and they have a bungalow that was built in, probably
yeah.
the 70s, thereabouts.
1970s. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I thought that was because the different generations, that each generation built one. So actually, are you saying that the farmhouses, which by the way, I'd love to get my hands on to restore, but and there's so many. When I look out my window, I see so many. Actually,
Yeah,
where I live on the laneways in Connemara, it is so common to have the outline of all 3 still on the same site,
yeah.
but only obviously one being occupied,
Well, yeah,
sometimes none being
yeah.
occupied. So were they not generational moves? They were
No,
actually
no,
policy moves.
that was actually, dare I say it, vandalism by the Irish government at the time, because
I don't disagree. Yeah.
the other stipulation they had, that if you moved out of your drafty, cold, damp farmhouse and built a new bungalow, which you got a grant for, um, they insisted that you take the roof off your old building so that it couldn't be used. So, in one fell swoop, the Irish government of the time destroyed the vernacular architecture of our country. But sorry, maybe you don't
No,
want
but
to
that
go.
is no, but actually, do you know what? Actually, this is where I apologize to the listeners and say this is where I indulge my interest, because this is what I walk past every day. This is what I see every day. And by the way, this is what I am trying to restore in rural Ireland. We would love, and the thing is, I'm not alone in this at all. That actually, we know that people would love to be able to restore those. And in fact, there have been some very recent rulings across some local authorities in the West, not Galway, but some local authorities in the West, where actually they're taking a very deteriorated state of the farmhouse to say, actually, that we can't
Mm.
consider that to be a dwelling. So actually, it doesn't even fall
Yeah,
under the vacant or derelict homes,
no,
and
no,
doesn't qualify for planning. It's like you're on a green field.
absolutely. And I had this instance in Ross Mindle in the county Mayo, where a lady bought one of these derelict kind of sites that had the four walls of a cottage. And a lot of people would have called it a famine cottage, because a
Mm.
lot of them were deserted during the famine, and nobody kept them up. But there are many, many more that happened in the 1960s. But yeah, and when I went to meet the planner and said, look, she really wants to do the right thing, and we can restore this cottage and do a very sensible and sensitive extension to it to
Yeah.
make it her new family home. And the planner said, no, we can't do that. We deem it to be a greenfield site.
Yeah.
And and when I tried to argue the carbon cost of demolishing this and building a new building was just nonsensical. So I
Um,
think I think there
yeah.
again, just sorry to put in, but there again, I think it's education of our planners, and that we really need to get them thinking differently and saying, well, why not restore a derelict house or a derelict cottage?
But is it the planners, or is it the policy? Because to
Yeah,
me, as somebody who's born and raised in rural Ireland, I choose rural Ireland. My daughter recently moved back to save, moved back home to be able to save to get a mortgage, and she's
yeah,
house hunting in rural Ireland. It would never occur to her to live in a city, and quite frankly, it would not be her choice to live in a
yeah.
town, maybe a rural village. But she wants to live rurally, as I did, as my
Mhm.
parents chose. And but policy does not support that. I definitely, and in fact, actually, later this evening, I'm attending a public housing meeting in rural Connemara, because the people of rural Ireland don't believe that the government wants the next generation living in rural Ireland. So is this really a planning issue, or is it a policy issue that planners are being
I
told to execute?
um I wouldn't go that far that they're being told. I think it's a bit of a what would you call it? A delayed action. I think the policies were written in the 70s and 80s, and they didn't want to encourage people. And they haven't updated those policies. And the planners are choosing to deliver those policies as opposed to putting pressure on the department, or
Um, Okay, do you
to
know, Peter,
to
I'm going
update.
to I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have your expertise on the line. And again, apologies to any of our listeners. We will get back to the retrofitting conversation in just a minute. But no, genuinely, I want to ask this question because I cannot get a reasonable response. And that is, we know the policy to discourage one-off rural homes is because the building of one-off rural homes is not sustainable, which, by the way, I
Yeah,
accept. I accept there has to be a
totally.
more sustainable way for living in the rural. But I have two questions for you, please. One question is, how do you define sustainable housing? What do you see sustainable housing as being?
Well, I suppose it really depends on where it is, and I totally agree with you. And and it was probably on Toshka actually that really pushed the banning of single houses in rural Ireland. But I think they meant well, because what they didn't want is, a kind of, with all due respect, a a Donna Bate bungalow stuck in rural Connemara.
Mm.
And I remember Frank MacDonald many years ago did a talk, and I think he called it Bungalow Blitz, I think.
Yeah.
And he showed photographs of a housing estate in, let's say, North Dublin, and a housing estate in rural Connemara,
Yeah.
and you'd swear they were identical.
Yeah.
And that's what we don't need. But again, yes, I would agree. One-off housing, unless it's an absolute for the continuation of, let's say, somebody wanting to farm that land and they don't want to be living in a town or in a village. But if you can build clusters of, 5 to 10 houses, but sensitively and sensibly, then that's probably the most sustainable thing because you're sharing a lot of the services. You're not putting individual electricity into houses and plumbing into houses,
Yeah.
waste management into houses. And if you can do that, that's probably the ideal. Um, but if you've also, got older houses, there is actually a carbon credit, if you like, that if you have an old building there, it's probably spent its carbon in its life. We did a study and we found that in around 50 years, so if a house lasts 50 years, the building fabric part of that house is carbon neutral. And therefore, what you then do to it, either by, and there are ways of doing conservation, renovation, and energy upgrade with low carbon solutions. You don't have to, and in fact, we would totally discourage people to go in and put, a polystyrene or a polyurethane insulation in an older building because the older building allows moisture to move. It's generally, I don't like the word, but it's generally called breathable.
Mm.
And if you put a non-breathable insulation, then you are creating this moisture barrier, which not only then interferes and it degrades the building fabric, it actually creates moisture problems and can lead to mold growth and therefore health issues within a house. So we tend, when we're talking with people and advising people, we always look at kind of more natural products like wood fiber board, like sheep's wool in attics, or and yes, they're a little bit more expensive, but they are much, much more effective.
Peter, going back to the example you gave earlier around the Rubrics building that was built in the 1600s and yet has measured on modern scales low U value. How
Yeah.
was that achieved? So what was the building material or methodology in the 1600 that we've lost?
It was a clever building, but it's using brick and lime. And what we're finding in all of our research around the world, and particularly with Historic Environment Scotland, for instance, and ourselves, we do a lot of joint research, and we've been physically measuring older buildings rather than using the BER or EPC.
Hmm.
um, what we're finding is that these buildings perform much, much better than anticipated, or in this, as I said earlier, default value that the bodies that have given it. And therefore, we're definitely saying that a lot of BR and actually I'm kind of moving myself back to rural. I grew up actually in a small village called Greystones in County Wicklow, but
Okay.
I've lived in Dublin for the last 30 years, and we're now selling our house. And when the BEO assessor came around to do it, I made sure that I was there so that I could talk through what they were doing, because they were going tick, tick, tick. And I knew I was going to get a bad BER rating. But in fact, this was an old Muse of 1720 that I had converted. When I bought it 30 years ago, Billy the Pony was still the last resident. And I knew they were going to do it as the default, but I had taken all the measures and I was able to give them, and they did accept it in the end with a bit of an argument. But so we're starting off on the wrong foot. So because this build, the red brick, particularly on the front, was nearly 400 millimeter thick solid brick. It's a thermal mass that actually keeps heat and therefore doesn't lose it that much. It's roofs, windows, and floors that lose most energy within our existing buildings and even new buildings. But in fact, the back wall of the same building was built of Calp limestone, which is a Dublin limestone, was a quarry in Rathmines, which is now completely built over. But that was about 500 mil thick, and somebody had put cement render on the outside of it, and in the 1950s, and we did a U value of it as it was. We took the cement render off because cement is non-breathable, it traps moisture. We took the cement render off, allowed the stone to dry, and we did a U value of that stone. The U value with the cement was 1.9. The U value of the stone without the cement was 1.3. So it meant the cement was entrapping moisture, which then creates a colder wall. If a wet wall is a cold wall.
Yeah.
And then we put back an insulated lime render on the outside, and it came down to 0.9.
Did the BER assessor did the BER assessment reach the right assessment? No.
We did our own assessment with all our technical information,
Yeah.
and we got it to a B2, which is phenomenal for a building of that age.
Yeah.
If we went out to the market and asked a BER assessor who didn't understand older buildings and came in and used this tick box, it'd be probably a C3. And that's where the problem is, really.
Yeah. Do you know, genuinely, this is the first time I've heard this, but all I'm thinking of are the consequences for somebody trying to avail of a green mortgage. But the other side of it is for people who don't have your knowledge. Actually, one of the things that you talked about today that I had never heard before is that actually, even in taking on a very serious retrofit project for an older home, that actually, you know, you described it as really understanding the building. So that would help maybe shape what you're trying to achieve. And so I naively thought that you're always trying to achieve the best rating you can.
No.
And that's not necessarily the case at all.
Absolutely not. And I would actually argue against achieving an A-rated building in an older building, because if you do that, you're actually probably putting the wrong types of products into it, and it's going to have massive unintended consequences.
Are you kind of talking strictly because the nature of your work is around conservation and protecting the built environment heritage? When you talk about actually not aiming for the highest performance, are you talking about we're not aiming for the highest rating? Are you saying that because you want to keep the aesthetic of the building, or actually to enhance the performance of the building?
It's both. It's both. In a lot of cases, but then when you think about it, I mean, yes, when I said earlier, you know, that if we use the word heritage, one thinks of Buckingham Palace or you know, Custom House, and they all have incredibly, and actually we're doing a study at the moment on the Oris and Uachtaráin, and we know there are certain areas of that building that we cannot go near inside, even consider insulation. So we're looking at alternatives, and if we over insulate the roof and over insulate the floor, you're going to get that whole kind of building up to a much better rating. Now, you're not going to make it an A rate, you know, and in this case, for those staterooms, which are the important bits, we may have to settle for, you know, let's say a building rating of maybe C2 or C3. But what we're doing in that case is, because there's a lot of land around it, we're able to actually implement renewable sources of heating, and therefore it's going to bring the energy rating down. I think we'll probably get it to a B3 or certainly a C1. And that to me is a comfortable building. You've not gone overboard. You've not spent too much money on your retrofit. And this is often what's happening is people say, oh, I'm not buying an old building because it's going to cost too much to retrofit. It is if you're trying to overachieve something.
Peter, in your experience, how much confusion is there out there? Because I know from the social media that we generate, the comments within community groups, particularly Facebook groups, and there's some really ardent, enthusiastic people who are embarking on not just retrofitting projects of their own, but deliberately going out and searching for a property, usually those old farmhouses, to buy one, to be able to do this work. But actually, there's a real fear around what's the right thing to do, and also about the advice changing. So, for example, you talked about heat pumps, and then maybe the experience in the UK, which is definitely impacting people in Ireland around their choices. And I think it is somewhat reminiscent of a time when people were told to put spray foam as insulation, and now suddenly people with spray foam insulation can't sell their homes, but there's a real problem in terms of people, not just people know to seek out expert advice, but actually understanding, are the
Yeah,
experts expert? Is the expert
yeah.
advice I'm getting? And in the last number of
Um,
years, with all the grants for retrofit, we're seeing the rise in one-stop shop. So people who will help you through your grant application, they'll advise on the work to be done, and then they carry out the work to be done. And there's so that raises the question of, where does the advice piece come in, and who can give that advice?
let's say there's 11 one-stop shop units in Ireland, in the Republic, giving advice. Not one of them, and I know this for a fact, not one of them has any experience on advising in older buildings. So and yet people read this and say, oh, it's a one-stop shop, so they should know everything. And these innocent people go in and say, well, what should I do with my 1940s council house or my derelict farmhouse? And unfortunately, they are making recommendations and getting grants that will put in our terms, the wrong insulation. They'll bring it up to too high a standard, and it'll cost the owner more money. But worse still, it's actually not going to save them a huge amount of energy. There is no one fix all either solution to any of these, because as I say, you might get a 1940s house that only has maybe a 300 mil concrete wall, and it'll be 1930s concrete, so it's not well compacted, and therefore it's much more porous, and you get a lot more kind of either air or heat movement through it. But if you get an old stone cottage down in Connemara that's maybe 400 mil thick stone, you cannot treat the two of those buildings exactly the same.
Peter, may I ask you a question there, just in terms of, you've referred, a lot to the pre-1945 buildings, and I think you said the figure was somewhere around 26 to 30% of the housing stock across Europe is that,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
only a small amount of that, was it 6 to 8% is listed or protected. So that's a huge chunk of property that, if it hasn't already been done, will need to be retrofitted and taken care of. And you talked about maybe the one-stop shops being best suited for the 80s onwards build. And so when you talk about an old house, what do you mean? And the reason I'm asking the question is specifically for people who, who might be listening into this show, because we talk regularly about how to find properties on and off market that might be suitable for or would qualify under the derelict or vacant homes grant. Many of these across rural Ireland, but indeed in our towns and cities. So when you talk about an old house, what are you talking? Like, what age are you talking?
To be honest, if we were to look at pre-1960s, the first oil crisis came in and happened in 1974. And that's when people started looking at insulating houses. Now, a lot of houses in the late 60s, early 70s were built with cavities, but perhaps not with insulation. And if you have a cavity, then it's an easier job to pump insulation into that. Now, again, I argue it should be the right insulation, but that's another day's work. But anything pre-1960s really could be deemed to be a traditional building, which means it has a solid wall construction. But again, those buildings wouldn't have any decorations on the inside, wouldn't have any historic components to it. So in fact, they're quite easy to upgrade from an energy point of view. Again, as long as the right approach is taken. The department, again, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage published a new set of guidelines in February, and they're available on their website. And that's a pretty good starting point for anybody, and they're downloadable free. So, you know, if a homeowner, if somebody's thinking of buying an older house, I'd advise them first of all to go onto the LGH website and download that document. As I say, it was launched by the minister in February, and it's got a really good, you know, it's a long document and it's a bit of a read, but it's written not in a technical way so that ordinary people that just own houses and don't understand buildings can actually go through it and say, oh, you know, I should do this or I should do that.
Very
I
good.
think we are making progress as well. Sorry to
No,
again,
that's
but
good. That's good.
we're actually doing a study at the moment with University of Limerick and Limerick County Council, City and County Council. And we've chosen 100 buildings where we're putting energy monitors into each of these buildings. And we're being fed information back to our laptops that say, oh, well, you know, actually, Mary, if you only boil your kettle 5 times a day instead of 12 times a day, you'll save 10% energy, you know. But it's also giving us information, and we've chosen about 6 different typologies to do actual U value analysis on it. And then on another study, and these are both studies are funded by SEAI, so they are aware and they're trying to gather the hard evidence. And the other one is with UCD, where we've taken 50 different typologies of older buildings, and we're going to make a database of U values, of proper U values, which will then feed into the BEOR assessment instead of having this default. And just, I suppose, one other thing that I'd like to mention, if you don't mind, is we've been with a lot of these grants, and we had this situation on a church. I won't mention where, but the poor priest decided he wanted to upgrade his church from an energy point of view, also to make it more comfortable for the parishioners. And he got approved by SEAI for a grant, but he and his advisor, an architect, chose to use a natural product, a wood fiber board. And then when he went to claim the money, SEAI wouldn't give him the money because they only certify insulations that have an agreement cert. And there's only 2 products in Ireland that have an agreement cert, and that's polystyrene and polyurethane. And you know, you just should not use those products in an older building. So, you know, SEAI have learned from that, and they're about to announce, I believe, a new grant scheme for older houses. It's due out in the next couple of weeks, and it's going to be a pilot scheme, and it's going to identify about 100 different buildings around the state and actually give decent grants to properly upgrade those buildings without having to do agreement certs and things. So that's really exciting. And
Yeah.
again, I'm hoping this time next year when they say, wow, that was brilliant, let's roll it out, it'll become a more standard.
Well, well, hopefully so, if it makes life a little
Yeah,
less complicated, because one of our aims in reaching out to you and in speaking to you today was because it was to try get clarity for people, and also to settle some online debates as well, but really to get clarity for people who are currently in their home and considering a retrofit program, or they're looking to buy an older home and
yeah.
trying to get a sense of the work ahead, the cost, and the likely outcome that they can achieve. And honestly, I was hoping that we'd be able to make it less complicated, but actually I can see that we have a real difficulty in terms of maybe a lot of information, but not knowing the credibility of that information, not being able to really be confident about the veracity of the data that we're reading. And actually, even your comments around the BER assessments actually almost point to more questions rather than
Yeah.
answers. And I know that we are probably, relatively speaking, still early in our sustainability journey when we're talking about bringing a whole nation of
Yeah.
homes up to scratch. But it's definitely kind of a more complex topic. And I think that if the industry and the people maybe who are serving the industry are struggling to really understand and get the data they need, actually you can see how consumers would really feel a little
Oh,
bit at sea at this.
absolutely. And I do, and I feel that the government actually should be doing much more in the line of, say, doing a country tour of, information nights or
Yeah,
afternoons or Saturday mornings or whatever, where you get people with the knowledge, like myself and others, to go and actually just and I mentioned earlier that Wexford did this, and it was hugely successful.
yeah,
And what we did is we had like after each talk, we had a clinic. And I sat there behind a desk and people came up with photographs of their house and saying, what can I do with this? And, and out of that then grew a slight demand where
yeah,
people wanted to pay, 300 to 500 quid to get the right advice, um, and that is something we do offer. But again, it's getting it out there into the public domain that, and it's much better to spend, say 500 getting the right advice than maybe, 400 getting a BER and then saying, oh, geez, what do I do with it now?
yeah, yeah.
you know?
And so actually in terms of that's fascinating that people can come with a photograph. How much can you tell from a photograph about the
Well,
structure of
not a huge, but we
I
would talk
I
to them and
thought,
say,
okay.
what's your wall and what type? And in some cases, if it's a complex house, we'd say, look, it needs a site visit, and therefore we'll come up on X day and just have a walk around, and then we'll give them a 2-page kind of pointer on what to do, or more importantly, Carol, what not to do.
Yeah.
Because
And it is about that what not to do piece.
yeah,
And Peter, I'm going to use your website link as the way to quash all Facebook arguments that break out
oh God,
about retrofit, because this is a hot topic.
it
So
is.
genuinely, thank you so much, and apologies. I know we've gone over time, but there's just so much in this,
No,
and
there is.
I feel like really we've probably only raised more questions than we've answered today, but actually maybe there were questions that need to be raised, and we might just pick this up. Maybe we might just pick this up again when and take a more of a focus and take maybe
Sure.
one house typology
Yeah.
and a certain type of grant, and just to try give a little more focused information, because I know that people are genuinely lost and struggling with this, and they're fearful to make the wrong decisions. They're fearful to choose a technology that they'll be told in 10 or 15 years time they can't sell their home, they can't remortgage their home. So actually
Yeah.
people are fearful around this, and fearful people tend not to do anything, which is not going to help our the sheer
No, it
volume of
doesn't. Yeah.
homes we need to
Yeah.
retrofit as well.
Yeah.
So it's actually, we as a nation, we've a vested interest in getting this right. So look, thank you so much for being so generous with your
It's
time
a
and expertise today.
it's a pleasure. Nice talking to you, Carol.
Oh, you too. And best wishes on your move back to the rural. I can heartily endorse it, and I know you will enjoy it. So thank you so much.
Okay.
And that was Peter Cox, Managing Director at Carrig Conservation International Limited. My thanks to Katie Tallon and Caoimhe Scully, the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. Also, thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next episode here on iProperty Radio.